book has two stories.
The one it tells.
And the one it hides.
Welcome to The Secret Life of Books.
I'm Sophie G, academic and writer.
And I'm Jonty Claypole, broadcaster and producer.
In this podcast, we tell the story behind the story of the literary classics everybody wants to read, feels they should read, or has already read and loved.
Today, The Odyssey by Homer.
The Odyssey is one of the oldest and most influential books ever written. But despite the fact that it's attributed to somebody who we all call Homer, we actually know very little to nothing about its authorship. It's an epic poem, over 12,000 lines long, about the length of a modern novel, presented in 24 books, or chapters, whatever you want to call them, and it tells the story of the aftermath of the Trojan War, the attempts of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, to return to his homeland and continual efforts to foil him in that attempt. It ends in an unseemly bloodbath when he finally gets back there. The story's famous for many, many reasons. There's almost no line that hasn't been gone over and over again in literature because of the Cyclops, the sirens, the lotus eaters, and many, many other side characters and adventures. But these iconic encounters only occupy a short part of the book, which is mostly about Odysseus and his son Telemachus trying to deal with a horde of 110 suitors, as they're called, or parasites, who've taken over Penelope's palace back home.
The Odyssey has many themes we recognise: nostalgia, revenge, parental authority, but our understanding of the book is limited to our own concerns, and it is often hard to understand what the author or authors are really driving at. It's also written in ancient Greek, which neither Sophie nor I understand, and although the author is called Homer, we actually know nothing at all about who or what Homer was. So to make sense of it, we are turning to the worlds and our favourite classicist, a Don and a Dame, none other than Mary Beard. Mary, welcome to The Secret Life of Books.
Hello.
Hello, Mary.
Hello. Great to be here.
Well, is it? Because I just want to point out it is Sunday evening for you, and one does not necessarily want to be recording a podcast on Sunday evening. So it is very noble and virtuous of you to have joined us at this time.
I couldn't resist the invitation.
No, that's very kind. Jonty, I'm not sure that you and I should be admitting on international television, aka YouTube, that we don't read Greek. Should we? Is that all right? I guess so.
It's not too late, Sophie. It's not too late.
We can dial it back. Yes, exactly. Or we can get into it. Yes.
So, Mary, we're going to ask you the questions we normally ask ourselves. Why is the Odyssey a classic? But actually also, I'd love to know, where were you, how old were you, and what were you wearing when you first read the Odyssey?
Well, let me start with that, because I do read Greek, and I went to a very old-fashioned girls' high school in the UK, and I started Greek when I was 14, I think. So I know that what I was wearing my rather unflattering school uniform when I first read the Odyssey, because after we'd done the basics of Greek, the first book that we were introduced to, not all of it by any means, I think it was book 9 actually, or was it 10, was Homer's Odyssey. And so I still remember the room that we were in, and I remember finding it really quite tough, because this was the first bit of real ancient Greek that I'd read. But, the Odyssey, I think, works every time. And I just I got won over by it. And it's also the kind of bit of ancient Greek that it gets easier very quickly. I mean, people now read it and they say, gosh, there's lots of repeating lines. There are, adjectives and epithets which recur, and they're the same ones for the same characters. Now, there's all sorts of good artistic reasons for that. But I tell you that if you're reading it for the first time, it makes it a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah. And actually, just to drill down on the sort of Latin vs Greek thing for a minute, because you're primarily a Latinist, I think. Is that right, Mary, eventually?
I kind of work more on the Romans, but you can't work on the Romans without working on the Greeks. And an awful lot of Roman stuff is actually written in Greek. So I think everybody has to be a bit ambidextrous.
And what I wanted to ask you, there's some sort of boarding school motto about, you learn Latin to become a man or something and Greek for a treat. Is Greek, when you're reading it in the original, does it have a sort of, I don't know, flow to it or ease to it or, creative? Some people say it's a more creative language than Latin. Is that your experience of it?
People do fall in love with it. I think that's absolutely true. And they say those kind of things. I think it never worked quite that sort of magic for me. Although, I still think that the Odyssey is the book I take to my desert island. So it works some sort of magic.
Very apt. I also love in the Centrinians pantheon, were you one of the scruffy ones or one of the very well-dressed, immaculate ones?
I'm afraid I was a swot who wanted to be scruffy and cool.
In Australian parlance, you were a dag.
Thank you, Sophie. I shall remember that for next time.
Yes, that's the one to trot out. Okay, Mary, why is it a classic?
Well, I'm sure when you ask this question, almost everybody says, well, it depends what you think a classic means. And there have been all kinds of attempts to define what it is to be a classic bit of literature, quite often coming down to saying, well, it's something that you feel you ought to have read but haven't. Now, perhaps for some people that is quite a good definition of the Odyssey because, it is composed a very long time ago. It has a sort of aura about it that you can be quite scared of saying, right, what am I going to take to bed tonight? I'm going to take some Homeric epic. So it's got a bit of a barrier, I think, around it, which I think is absolutely unnecessary. Because I think that for me, if I were to say kind of more seriously why I thought the Odyssey was a classic, I would say it is so embedded in particularly Western, but not only Western literature, that you couldn't sort of remove the Odyssey out of the literary canon and leave that literary canon making much sense. Because it's absolutely there, read, reread, and reworked, whether that's James Joyce or whether it's the Coen brothers, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which was a movie version of the Odyssey in a certain way. Or I was very pleased when Bob Dylan gave his Nobel Prize lecture. There was Dylan. I was delighted, in a sense, citing himself in that tradition. So I think it's a classic because it's become indispensable in some ways. I think the other thing about it, I mentioned just now that there was that you can feel, oh gosh, Homeric epic, that's a kind of big deal. I've never met anybody, and maybe they don't always tell me the truth about things like this, I've never met anyone who hasn't said that it was really worthwhile and glad they'd read it. And you can go out there and find plenty of people who say, oh, they told me to read Middlemarch and I thought it was a complete waste of time or whatever. I've never met anybody who says, oh, the Odyssey was a complete waste of time. So I think it's...
And one of the brilliant things about that, actually, is that, many of the kind of, I was about to say derivative, but let's say homage texts to the Odyssey, like Paradise Lost or Ulysses or, any of those things, people do say, oh, that was a massive bore. Like, for example, I personally can't stand Ulysses by James Joyce. I find it intensely irritating. But then you go back to the original and you're, I don't actually know how to pronounce this individual's name. Is it Nausicaa or Nausicaa?
You can say it either Nausicaa or Nausicaa.
Okay.
There are, don't worry about any of the pronunciations of the proper names.
Oh, that's a relief.
Well, phew.
Yes.
Okay, because we had a mini discussion about that ahead of time.
I've had a sleepless night worrying about the Laestrygonians.
I will say Laestrygonians, and you'll just have to forgive me if it's not what you say. But
brilliant.
But just that's the least of your worries. And I absolutely agree with you, Sophie. I'm afraid I'm going to confess that Joyce's Ulysses is something I've struggled with a bit. But if you go back to the kind of original, the inspiration of this, it is immediately, I think, not just gripping, it immediately engages your kind of intellectual curiosity. Now, and I think some classicists will shudder at what I'm about to say, and I think it's much more rewarding, certainly for a first-time reader, than Homer's Iliad. The pair epic with the Odyssey, probably composed a little bit earlier. The Iliad is quite tough going, and you do come to book 2 very quickly in the Iliad, which turns out to be a list. Just a list of ships.
Yes, the sort of decision to reduce the number of catalogues in the sequel, in the Odyssey, was a good decision, I think.
I think it was a good decision. And so you get in there, and there's an amazingly both lucid but wonderfully complicated story in a set of Chinese boxes that I think I've never met anyone who doesn't get off on it in some way. So for me, classic.
Yeah. I know, I was surprised reading it. I haven't read the Odyssey all the way through before, and in my mind it was going to all be about the sirens, about the Cyclops, and the great shock, of course, is that the famous part of the Odyssey occupies quite a narrow part of the book, and so it's actually, despite the fact I thought I knew the Odyssey and I thought I knew the stories in it, when you're reading it, you discover how little you know actually, and that there's a whole other thing going on. But I wanted to ask you, Mary, this is The Secret Life of Books. What is the secret of the Odyssey for you?
Well, I think another version of the Odyssey being a classic is that every time you read it, it does surprise you. There's more there than you ever thought there was. And for me, the thing that I suppose about 10 years ago now surprised me, and which I've never stopped thinking about really, is a little story from the very beginning, near the beginning of the first book of the Odyssey. And it's one I hadn't noticed before. Can't think how I hadn't noticed it. But we're in the palace at Ithaca, and there's Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who is waiting for Odysseus to come home from the Trojan War, and there's her slightly wet behind the ears son, Telemachus, who was just a baby when Odysseus went off. And, things are not going brilliantly while Odysseus is away, and they're not sure whether he's dead or whether he's alive, when he's going to come back. And Penelope, this particular moment, is working in her women's quarters in the palace upstairs. And she listens out and she hears a bard strumming his lyre and singing his songs in the common space below. And she thinks, well, they're pretty gloomy songs, right? They're about what a terrible time the heroes of the Trojan War are having coming back to their homeland.
She needs Bob Dylan, basically, to be in the court.
Yeah, she thinks that's a bit of a downer, isn't it? So she goes downstairs to the bard and says, the modern equivalent of, please, can you put on a more cheerful record, right? Can you sing a happier song? And at that moment, her son, the wet behind the ears Telemachus, comes up to her and says, Mother, speech is man's business. Go back upstairs. And she does. Now, that now is one of the bits of the Odyssey which is absolutely, really fixed in my mind. What I was amazed about was that when I was beginning to think of a book that I wrote as lectures originally a few years ago, which was published as Women and Power, I was wanting to trace the history of sexism and misogyny. And I was wanting to look back to the ancient world and to see how, to some extent, we're still using the same kind of tropes that they used. We're following somehow in their footsteps in putting down women. And I thought, I've just got to look at Homer. And I'd read the first book of the Odyssey, several times, starting when I was at high school, but, I then did it at university and I taught it. I'd never noticed, that moment when Telemachus tells Mum to shut up. and to go upstairs. And, I said in the book, look, this is the first time recorded in the history of the West that a son tells mum to not speak. He's silent. The first time he silences his mum. And it's so stuck in my mind ever after.
Yeah.
But I was equally surprised that I could have read the Odyssey so many times and just not seen it.
He does it 3 times. It's not just once at the start. It happens throughout the Odyssey. Penelope, every time she opens her mouth, is told to shut up.
Shut up. He's like, my kid.
Yes.
But I'm
Yes.
I'm so intrigued that you didn't notice it the first time. And I guess what happened in between was sort of second and third wave feminism in the 1970s and 80s. And so I guess there would have been an intellectual shift for you that when you came back to it older in life than from when you were a schoolgirl, these things suddenly stand out, which when you first read it were just, part of how society works.
Yeah. I mean, I have to plead guilty. I'd like to think that wasn't the case, but I think that it's the most likely explanation. But I think also it is a tribute to the way this long epic poem, probably it's no longer than a modern novel, but it holds so many, hidden bits that you do find on rereading and rereading. For me, it always repays having another look at, and you always see new and different things. And you can't imagine how you didn't see them before, really.
I think that's totally amazing. And actually, maybe we can chip in with really quickly our secrets. My secret is that it's never boring, unlike all other, spin-offs and rip-offs from the original Homer. And Mary, to your point about Telemachus telling his mum to shut up and go to her room, it also makes me realise that moment in Homer invites us to kind of read over or read past all the reiterations of that trope in subsequent retellings. Like, for example, I happen to have just been writing something about Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, and in that novel, Sophia Weston, the heroine, is constantly being told to shut up and go to her room by her father and then by Tom himself. And also, and you don't notice it because, Homer or whoever Homer was, wrote the program.
Yeah, we've been programmed not to notice women being told to shut up. And for me, it was a Homeric moment. Once you do, you find it everywhere.
Let's talk a bit. So we don't know anything, I don't think, about Homer. So we can't talk about Homer's life, but can you tell us a bit about the world or the context in which this epic poem emerges?
Well, emerges is a good word, Jonty, I think. We certainly can't tell anything about the life, times, date, or whatever, of the Homer that the ancient Greeks believed composed this poem. The ancient Greeks had quite a few details about him, where he was born, that he was blind, or whatever, etc., etc. It's all a wonderful kind of fantasy myth. But I think it's not even easy, though it's a bit easier, to say, well, what kind of world did it come out of? Because one thing I think we pretty well know for certain is that the origin of the Odyssey, just like the Iliad, was in an oral tradition of bardic poetry. I mean, when you meet the bards in the Odyssey, in a way, that is the sort of tradition out of which the poem in which they're depicted came, right? So we know that there is a layer of oral composition. What we don't know is how far back that goes, or when it was first put into any form of writing. People kind of guess that we're in the sort of 7th, 6th century BC when it's actually put into writing. But we don't know. We don't know when Homer as a name became attached to it. And we don't know what the process of that is. Did it become a fixed oral tradition first, which was then at some point written down? Or was it written down out of a whole kind of conglomeration of different bits of different sorts of composition from all over the Eastern Mediterranean? I mean, it's impossible to know. One thing that I think is terribly important, however, is to see that the subject matter, the Trojan War, if it ever took place, but let's suppose it did, the Trojan War and the clash between Greeks and Trojans and the homecoming of the Greek heroes. Myth or not, that was always imagined to be a long time before the poem was composed. So
Yes.
we've got kind of different layers, and we can see that there are different layers, but it's very hard to work out any narrative of composition. People have tried forever to do that, both in antiquity and in the modern world.
Yes.
And, they look at the kind of objects are described in the poem. What date do those objects look like? They look at the kind of social life that appears to be going on. This is no way a democracy. This is a series of aristocrats, etc., etc. And we still don't know. It's
really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I was, listening to you describing that, and just the lacuna, the gap, the not knowing, makes me realise even more that the act of translating this poem is an interpretative act in a really you're sort of giving it a voice, and you're giving it a kind of cohesion that the original doesn't exactly lack, but it needs to be sort of filled in. And so guided by you, we read Emily Wilson's 2017 translation when we were getting ready for this episode, which is a genuine page turner. I mean, I was absolutely whipping through it. I'm an 18th century scholar, and so my Odyssey before this one was Alexander Pope's Odyssey, which I did a quick revisiting of actually in preparation for this episode. And, actually Pope's Odyssey has a lot to recommend it. I can see why, he could buy a nice house after he did it. But Emily Wilson kind of gives this modernity. She sort of gives modernity back to the poem, as well as preserving this sense that you're describing of the kind of ancientness of it, the sort of has already played out, it's already mythic. So let's start by just talking about the first 4 books briefly, which are known, I believe, Jonty informs me of this, as the Telemachy. Is that when you're having a chat about the Odyssey, do you talk about the Telemachy?
People do. It's not a word that often escapes my lips, but people do.
Yes,
so you're absolutely right. Yes.
Okay, I've never used it before.
I was hoping to impress you, Mary, by putting that into the script. So,
well, you impressed.
Clearly.
You impressed me, Jonty. I'm impressed. I thought, wow, Jonty's really backed up the truck for this one. And so, what's happening in these opening books is that we're given this fascinating glimpse of Odysseus, who's stranded with Calypso on an island, unable to go anywhere, and then we kind of do a jump cut to the point of view of Telemachus, who you've described as the wet behind the ears son. I'm a sort of passionate defender of Telemachus. I feel his pain, poor fellow, without his dad for so long, and his mum and her weaving. He's like a sort of Steiner school kid. Yeah. But so tell us about the first few books, and specifically sort of why do you think, or how do you think this opening is so effective in setting up the world?
I think that there's something here which is really important about the complex sophistication of the Odyssey. And if somebody says to you, look, this is one of the earliest works of Western literature, it's probably a bit later than the Iliad, but still we're way back there at whatever date it is, you kind of imagine that Western literature would start in a simple way and get more complicated. That would be a natural and obvious assumption. Yeah. In fact, in the Odyssey, and to some extent in the Iliad, Western literature starts fantastically sophisticated and intellectually complicated. And you see that in the way that this 24-chapter, 24-book poem weaves in all these different stories, keeping them on the road side by side and sometimes interlocking in a way that never loses you, but is never anything but extremely complicated.
Yeah.
And there are different stories going on. And as Jonty said before, I think it's easy if you've read some sort of kids' book of tales from the Odyssey to think the Odyssey is all about Odysseus meeting the sirens or blinding the Cyclops or whatever. It's the adventures of Odysseus. In fact, that's a small part. And we have other stories that all combine. And the Telemachy is a hugely important part of this. I mean, this is a story about Odysseus coming home, that is for sure, and the problems he has. But also, it's a story about Telemachus growing up. That's why.
Absolutely.
He is a
and it's
he's a wet behind the ears teenager, but he becomes a man in the course of this. Yeah. And I think that's why.
And it's a story about Penelope, isn't it? I mean, because I wanted to ask you about the suitors and why they are so emphatically kind of presented to us in those opening books, how it gives us a glimpse of Penelope and her world, her experience, her life.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to start from manhood. And the first word of the poem is ἀνδρα, the Greek for man. And of course that's referring in part to, its obvious referent is Odysseus. He's the man of the poem. But there's other men. And it's about Telemachus. ἀνδρα is the sign of Telemachus. It's about how he becomes a man. But then, of course, in the palace, trying to basically... I think marry is a bit of a euphemism. I think suitor is a bit of a euphemism. There's more than 100 blokes from the town trying to tell Penelope that Odysseus is bound to be dead, and can one of them please marry her, right? So it's partly about that version of manhood too. There's different ways of being a man, and of course Penelope is there, and people found this very puzzling, and it is very puzzling, and it's been talked about a lot by the people who want to try to kind of get to the social reality, if ever there is anything that's real in the Odyssey. You've got these 100 suitors who, parasites, boors, they're just awful. They've taken over the palace, and they want to marry Penelope. Now, why do they want to marry Penelope? It's fairly clear in the text that the person who marries Penelope will become the king of Ithaca, right?
Yeah.
Now, that is certainly not what you would expect from a normal later Greek transmission of power. It's Telemachus who ought to be becoming the king of Ithaca if Odysseus doesn't get back.
Yeah.
Here, we've got this position where we think, so the guy who marries Penelope is going to be the big boss. Now, that makes, and has made, people start to think about the nature of power in this community, and also to look for other aspects of Penelope not just being the poor old mum who's shut up by the wet behind the ears teenager, but Penelope who is in certain sense controlling and manipulative, etc., etc. And
that's fascinating.
The famous story, or one of the famous themes, in the poem, is that she finally says, "All right, okay, I will, but first of all, I've got to finish weaving the shroud that Odysseus' father Laertes, who's also for some reason still alive. Why he's not still king, heaven only knows. Laertes is still alive, but I've got to finish his shroud so that when he dies, he's got a burial shroud ready." And this is a very famous bit of the story. She weaves all day, and then at night she unpicks the weaving, so she never finishes the shroud. Right?
Yes.
Now,
and the Laertes resonance, actually, and what everything you're saying here is helping me to understand something else that we talked about on The Secret Life of Books, which is the logic of power in Shakespeare's Hamlet, and why he has to have a character called Laertes, and why Gertrude is such a kind of problematic character in Hamlet, because this logic of power is being activated there as well, and learning from Homer. Yeah, amazing.
And of course it's very messy, but there are bits that you can extract from this which suggest that we're living in a world which is very different from 5th century Athens, say.
Yeah. And so I suppose the kind of parallel couple to Odysseus and Penelope are Menelaus and Helen. And Jonty felt, I see from his notes, that it's a bit of an anticlimax when Helen gets wheeled on in this epic.
I think it's
totally brilliant.
It's
discuss.
Totally
Very
brilliant.
Discuss.
I mean, Telemachus goes off in these first 4 books to find out what's happened to Dad, right? So he's going around all the Greek heroes to say, when did you last see my father, basically? And he fetches up at the palace of Menelaus and his reunited wife, Helen. Now, Helen was the woman who, by going off with the Trojan prince Paris, started a whole damn Trojan war, right? She was
the face that launched 1,000 ships.
Yeah, that's right. We know from, in the Iliad, we see her having a pretty rough time in the middle of the war. She was the cause of it all, and there she is, and she's feeling, it's not great. When Menelaus takes her back home. But I think what's brilliant is that then the Odyssey constructs the home life of Menelaus and Helen post-Trojan War as kind of a little bit suburban domestic.
Yeah.
Kind of middle-aged married couple. And I think that is just so good. Because again, here we are at the very beginning, and we expect at the very beginning of literature to be given the standard story, right? And there's, Helen is sitting up in her room all day, moping about Paris, who she's had to leave behind, etc., etc., and she was dragged back by her husband. Not one bit of it. So the tradition is born, in a way, critiquing itself and having a joke about itself. I think it's very funny.
That's completely brilliant.
It's a complete masterstroke. There's a wonderful moment where Helen lays all the blame on Aphrodite. So it's like the wife in a marriage who's had an affair. They've patched it up, and then she sort of retroactively, she's saying, well, Athena cast a spell on me and played a trick and made me not be in love with my fine, handsome husband. Yes. And they've created this noble life in order for them to continue their marriage. I agree. I loved that moment when I was reading it. Yeah. But anyway, so Telemachy is off looking for his father, and we then get to the next section, which are the books of the Odyssey that are the most famous, and those are the adventures Odysseus has on his way home. Homer does a rather clever trick where we don't begin at the start either. We're sort of dropped in halfway through, which again is very sophisticated in narrative terms. He drops us in quite late in the action. Odysseus has been held as a kind of sex slave on the island of Calypso.
That would be Odysseus's view, right?
Yeah. Yes. It's very nice, though. I mean, I really enjoyed the descriptions of the island, actually. I would have been quite happy there myself.
As far as supposed captivity goes, I think Odysseus has a pretty nice time of it. And he arrives at the island of the Phaeacians. Phaeacian. Yes, I was making it sound like slightly fecal matter, wasn't I? And in order to enlist their pity and support, he tells his story. And we then get in fairly breathless succession the stories of the Cyclops, the witch goddess Circe, a visit to Hades, the livestock of Helios, the sirens, and finally Calypso, which brings his narrative full circle. But I wanted to ask Mary, who is Odysseus? Because when I was reading it, I was really struck that he's not a hero in the way that we imagine a hero to be. He doesn't meet our expectations of a virtuous hero. He's continually referred to as a trickster and as a liar. And there's a moment where Athena talks to him, and in Emily Wilson's translation is saying, "You clever rascal, you're so talented at lying." And what's going on that right at the heart in this origin hero story, that the hero is not a virtuous character necessarily?
I think the whole poem, in some ways, signalled by that first word, ānδρα, man, is asking us to think about what a hero is, what a man is, what a good man is, what a bad man is. And Odysseus doesn't just simply represent heroism in any crude terms. He represents manhood in all its failings, its nastiness, its untrustworthiness, and its cleverness. He's dead clever. He's polytropos. He's a man of many kind of ways of doing things. And that is absolutely crucial to the portrayal of Odysseus in this poem, that he is not the perfect hero, far from it. In fact, the narrative of the whole poem reminds us, if we actually look at what happens, that he isn't the perfect hero. He sets out with his crew from Troy to come back home, and he's the only one who makes it. Is this a great, heroic leader who loses all the blokes that he's supposed to be saving? No, we know that he's failing in all kinds of ways. He's failing in his duties to be a leading man. Yeah. And yet he's doing that in all kinds of complicated ways. I mean, Emily Wilson, I think, uses the word at the very beginning. She translates polytropos as complicated. Tell me the story of a complicated man. And so again, here we are right at the beginning. And no, we haven't got a kind of cardboard cutout of, a heroic swashbuckling captain. We've got a man with all the difficulties and faults and vices and virtues and smartness that any hero does have, really. I mean, we're having it suggested to us. I think the heroism, is a much more complicated version of behaviour. What is it to be a hero? What is it to be a man? Etc. etc.
Yeah.
And
but you've got to hand it to Odysseus. He does awfully well in the kind of Iron Man challenge, like the thing where his raft breaks up and he has to get through the sea and all of that sort of stuff. And also Homer, such a deep understanding of seawater and its effects on the human body. That's all very heroic.
And he had such clever ideas. He wants to listen to the siren voices, which, these amazing female temptresses who would draw the man in as he sailed past and then to his death. But the voices are so beautiful that you always want to hear them.
So fascinating, that bit.
And also telling the Cyclops he's called nobody is still one of the great ruses in literary history, isn't it? It's so brilliant.
I think
yes.
And nobody has...
Should we have a quick pit stop on the Cyclops?
Yeah,
because Mary, I think the Cyclops is your favourite bit.
I think my favourite bit is the Cyclops. And very briefly, and I think it will be familiar to quite a lot of people, Odysseus lands on the Cyclops island. The Cyclops is a one-eyed giant who also is a cannibal. Odysseus and his mates are, they need some food, they need a place to have a rest, and they come into the Cyclops cave. And the Cyclops is out with his sheep. So they occupy the cave, they have a bit to eat, and the Cyclops then comes back. And it being the cannibalistic Cyclops, decides to have a couple of Odysseus's crew for supper, right, which he proceeds to do. I think the same thing happens the next night. How are they going to escape? Because the Cyclops puts a barrier across the mouth of his cave, so they can't get out during the day when he's doing his shepherding. So next thing that happens, Odysseus has one of these bright ideas. He gets the Cyclops absolutely plastered on wine. So he is completely flat out. He then gets his crew and himself to heat up a wooden stake in the fire in the Cyclops' cave. And while the Cyclops is comatose, he drives the stake into the Cyclops' one eye, leaving the Cyclops blind. The Cyclops wakes up, still wanting to look after his sheep, wants to let the sheep out of the cave so they can go to pasture. Odysseus wants to escape, but doesn't want to rouse any suspicions in the Cyclops. So he tells his men to hang on to the underside of the sheep. And they leave the cave. The Cyclops pats each sheep out on its back, but never realises there's a man underneath. Cyclops goes out. Odysseus and his men then go down to their boat. The Cyclops realises that he's been tricked, so howls and howls and howls, but he's been tricked worse than he thinks. Because when the Cyclops has asked Odysseus for his name, Odysseus said, "Utis, nobody is my name." The other giants on the island hearing this, the Cyclops, his name is Polyphemus, hearing Polyphemus's cry, says, what's happened, Polyphemus? Who's hurting you? Who's somebody done something bad? And Polyphemus, the Cyclops, replies, Otis, nobody's hurt me. So they're, that's all right then. And off goes Odysseus. Now, it's famous, it's been illustrated all kinds of times. It's a wonderful story, but it's also quite a disconcerting, destabilizing story. Because I think when you first read it, it's usually told from the point of view of Odysseus. Here we've got this nasty cannibal, and Odysseus has, manages, because he's a real smarty pants, manages to get his men out, having blinded the Cyclops. It doesn't take you, I think, long to see there's another side of this story. That, Cyclops, Polyphemus is a cannibal. Odysseus, however, and his men have come along uninvited, started eating the Cyclops' food, then they've got him pissed and blinded. They're invaders. And a lot of modern post-colonial stuff has said, look, this is the colonial experience written, composed in 8th or 7th centuries BC. They come and they take the land and they then maim and injure the original occupant. And, the Cyclops is a victim. He's not just a cannibal. But he is a cannibal. That's the problem.
Yes. Yes.
There's also a wonderful moment in Emily Wilson's translation where Odysseus justifies what he's done, and he says all this land around the islands and the neighbouring islands is all going to waste. It could be a great colony. But they've missed it, and therefore it's okay, because if the Cyclops aren't doing anything with it, then, we're totally entitled to go and make the most of it.
What colonising power has not used the Odyssean argument? And, you can read it with a large degree of sympathy for the Cyclops.
Totally. And, because actually also what colonising power hasn't used the argument of monstrosity or savagery,
right.
that it's fair game to be violent toward the enemy because they're monstrous. My favourite man of the hour, Henry Fielding, in reviewing the episode with the Cyclops in Tom Jones, says, "For my own part, I must confess, so compassionate is my temper, I wish Polypheme had confined himself to his milk diet and preserved his eye." So Fielding was really feeling the pain of all of that. Mary, I wonder if we can move now to the sort of return to Ithaca sections of the text, because again, these have this kind of texture and complexity to them that you don't get from the sort of children's book version of Homecoming, because it's actually a very complex and quite challenging or difficult homecoming. And one of its aspects is that Odysseus doesn't declare himself out of the gate. He comes back and in his kind of trickster mode does a bit of kind of spy work, a bit of undercover agency before he reveals to Penelope that he is in fact Odysseus. And indeed, Penelope is quite probably extremely suspicious and demands that he show the credentials. So can you talk us a little bit through what you think the poets are getting at with the sort of setup and complexity of this difficult homecoming?
Yeah, and it's a homecoming which lasts half the poem, actually.
Right.
But by book 12, Odysseus is fetching up in Ithaca, and it's not till book 24 that the poem ends. And he is in disguise. He's disguised as a beggar. He's lost all his crew. And there are all kinds of mini episodes where he's testing people out, trying to find out if Penelope is really who she says she is.
Yes.
And, I think you can explain that narratively. You can say, look, of course, if you come home after 20 years, you've got to be a bit circumspect, and you need, you don't kind of reveal who you are all at once, and you've got to check things out and find out who you can trust. There is a narrative logic to that. But I think there's something much more interesting going on. I think there's two things, really. And one is it's saying coming home isn't simple. You think, oh, homecoming, hello, darling, I've missed you terribly, let's go to bed. Isn't this wonderful? Homecoming is never easy, and in this case, it's particularly not easy because when Odysseus was going down to the underworld, he had a prophecy from the great prophet in the underworld, a man called Tiresias, that once he got home, he'd have to leave again. And he'd have to leave again with his oar on his shoulder, and he wouldn't be able to come home until he'd reached a part of the world which was so far from the sea that no one knew what an oar was. So we've got the homecoming, but we've also been told it's temporary, because this man is never going to stick at home. He's going to be off with his oar, maybe tomorrow, maybe a few months' time, but he's not here permanently. And I think, so the idea of the homecoming is always problematic. I think it's really important. I think the other thing, though, that's very important is that this is a poem about manhood, but it's a poem also about recognition and how do you know who somebody is? How do you recognize the hero or the husband or the man? It's a poem in which everybody is always potentially in disguise. The gods come down to involve themselves, but they're always disguised as somebody, as a mortal. Can you ever believe that the person you're looking at really is that person? And how do you know quite how they straddle the boundary between being alive and dead? For a lot of the poem, Telemachus doesn't know whether Dad's alive or not. And indeed, he has been down to the underworld, though bizarrely, he went down to the underworld, on a day return ticket and remained alive. So it's a poem. It is, I think, a poem about identity and about how you understand identity, how you know somebody. And a lot of the last books are about what is it that makes you know who that person is. In Odysseus' case, one of the things is the scar on his leg. Another thing is that the dog recognises him. There's a variety of things, but it's saying homecoming isn't easy and recognition is always problematic.
I love what you're saying about the difficulty of homecoming being such an important theme. And one of the things I loved about this book is the way it brings together all the different Greek myths and stories that you often know independently. So you might have seen a production of the Odyssey, or you might be aware of the Trojan War, but everything gets referenced. And as we saw that wonderful cameo by Helen that we talked about earlier, but the other shadow hanging over the Odyssey I was really struck by is that of Agamemnon. And so that's the homecoming that goes deeply, deeply wrong. Agamemnon gets murdered. And Odysseus knows about what's happened by the time he's back. He knows that you can't just go home and expect to be welcomed, that things have changed and it is dangerous. And Agamemnon, I think he even gets the last word, doesn't he? Almost. He appears at the very end.
Yes, when the suitors, the euphemistically called suitors, go down to the underworld themselves, dead, Agamemnon tells his story. And I think that it's one of the things that really shocks people when they get to the end, and it is part of the whole problematizing of homecoming, is that Odysseus and Telemachus are so brutally violent. They mow down the suitors. Yeah. Well, you might say, had it coming. But they hang the slave girls who had slept with the suitors. And there's a horrible little bit where they just hang them up, and you could see their feet still twitching for a while. And you think they were just the victims. And Odysseus and Telemachus come in and they just chop them down. And so badly that in the very last book, and people have been worried by this ending, almost forever, not wanting the Odyssey to end here. it looks as if there's going to be civil uprising in Ithaca, because half the Ithacans are on Odysseus' side. The other half are saying that was completely disgraceful. You've just, mown down the citizens of your state. And looks as if it could just all fall apart until the goddess Athena, in disguise, comes and tells them to forget it and get back down to live in peace, guys. In some ways, a quite unsatisfactory conclusion.
Yeah.
It is unbelievably violent, those final books, and it goes on and on and on. It becomes a Quentin Tarantino film, and we hear at one point how Odysseus becomes, quote, all smeared with blood after a lion eats a grazing ox. Its chest and jowls are thick with blood all over it, a dreadful sight, just so Odysseus had blood all over him. So, I mean, it is, as you're saying, it's quite a shock, that. And it sort of raises the question, Mary, what are we left with at the end of the Odyssey? What problem has the text answered? How does it make us feel?
I'm speaking for Homer, whoever he was here. And I think it hasn't answered the questions. It hasn't come out. And I think that's in one way why we need this kind of this divine ending, just to say, come on, everybody, forget it. Back to normal, because we haven't got a resolution. We've just got a divine intervention to stop the violence, and what we've done is we've been asked to pick apart, to analyse, to think again about marriage, about manhood, about what home is, about what civilization is, about how the world works, but. If you think Homer's going to have given you some, off-the-shelf answers to those questions, he's made you see those questions, I think in an extraordinarily new way, seeing that it's the oldest way we've got, right? So the oldest way we have, really, leaving the Iliad aside, of thinking about those questions is pointing us to make our own answers in a way that seems utterly new. And I think that's a
fascinating way of putting it. So we have a kind of routine at the end of episodes, which is that we talk about our favourite parts and our least favourite parts, or best bit, worst bit. So we know that your favourite is the Cyclops.
Yes.
Do you want to have an also ran? And where do you think things slow down and, could have used a cut?
My also ran, and I'm feeling guilty here because I'm looking at Jonty and I'm thinking he's just told me that I ought to think outside the box of Odysseus's adventures. I think the amazing bit where before Odysseus is going to tell his story, it's a kind of first-person narrative of all these things he's been through. He turns up on the island of Phaeacia. And, he's in a terrible mess, shipwreck. Oh, God, he's always looking dreadful.
Yeah.
And he comes across the princess of the island, who's out with her friends and servants. I think they're putting the laundry out or something. And
they're doing the laundry.
They're doing the laundry.
Of course.
And this kind of awful figure of this shipwrecked Odysseus climbs out of the undergrowth, and Nausicaa, it's her name, thinks that he looks disgusting. Right? So you've got this image of Odysseus being just, he's as monstrous in some ways as we were thinking that the Cyclops might be. Then, of course, everything turns round and he has a bath and he's dressed properly and he's been entertained in the kind of way you'd expect to entertain a traveller who's come and hit hard times in the royal palace. She sees him again and she thinks he's a god. And that, in a way, in part goes towards the blurry boundary, actually, between humans and gods. Gods are much more powerful, but you might mistake them for humans, or you might even mistake a human for a god. So I think it sets off a whole load of theological questions
I
I
love
think
that.
it's not just intellectual. I think that's the romantic in you, Mary. It's a frog print. It's a frog print story.
Yes, okay.
And
All
I
right.
think
Yes.
I think that's the 16-year-old Mary Beard reading the Odyssey for the first time.
If only I
and
could be her, yes.
Yes, if you were doing your laundry and you saw this thing and gave it a kiss, it could become a beautiful prince.
Okay.
You've also completely recuperated Nausicaa from James Joyce, who
Yes,
does
yeah,
dreadful things to
yes.
it in Ulysses.
Yes.
Last shout out before we get to the question, is the Odyssey overrated or underrated? We've not talked about something that we definitely need to bring back, Jonty, and that is the practice of rubbing people down with oil. There's so much of it going on.
Yes.
Whenever you're feeling a bit rough, just have an oil rub and boom.
Yeah.
Speak for yourself.
Everything's better.
I have an oil rub every night, so I mean,
Olive
don't you?
oil, extra virgin, Evu. Yeah.
Never done it myself, but if you recommend it, Jonty, perhaps I'll give it a go. I think it's mostly men who get rubbed down with olive oil, I must
You're
say.
right. You're right. The oil is reserved for the men. Is the Odyssey overrated or underrated, Mary?
I think you couldn't possibly overrate it. I suppose I wish more people were perhaps emboldened to read it, because, you know, that you do think that a 24-chapter book, Greek epic, could be a bit of a tough one to bite off.
Yeah,
So
a slog.
I think it's beyond the scale of rating. I think it is right there, inextricable from the Western literary tradition, right down to the road movie. I mean, in some ways, it's the first road movie, isn't it?
Yeah.
And road movies are always complicated, particularly when you wonder whether you've got home or not.
Thank you so much, Mary. And actually, I just want to do a shout out. As you're saying, it is very readable. And I think Emily Wilson's translation makes it even more readable.
Yeah.
I know Sophie has a soft spot for Alexander Pope's translation. It is a bit of a slog, I find, Alexander Pope's
It's a
translation.
heavy lift, yeah.
But Wilson does make it really readable. And anyone who is listening who has not read the Odyssey, I highly recommend they get Emily Wilson's recent translation, because it does crack through at great pace.
Yeah.
But Mary, thank you so much for your time and for illuminating us about the Odyssey.
Thank you both. And just remember, it's never too late to learn Greek.
That is such a good note to end on. And everyone, you've been listening to The Secret Life of Books.